It's the last place you'd expect to see them. But the Australian Outback is home to the largest herd of wild camels in the world. From just several thousand brought to Australia in the mid-1800s, they now number over 1 million. It's a remarkable story of outback survival. The men who brought them here, the Afghan and Indian Cameleers, brought not just their know-how to the bush, but their culture and their religion.
They were tough, I think they were resilient, and maybe a little bit crazy.
They probably gave Australia the lifeline to the outback.
They just came here with a job to do, and they just went off and they did it.
Last of the lords of the desert, who carried out food and water on a string of 50 camels. Old Bija de Verish, the giant Afghan, who fought the desert by compass and by Quran.
The Afghan Cameleers and their ships of the desert were a turning point in the development of the Australian interior. Camel trains brought urgently needed supplies to outback communities. They carted materials to build the overland telegraph. They assisted miners during the West Australian gold rush and were invaluable during expeditions into uncharted territory.
It was very clear that the Afghans would provide a solution, or certainly camels would provide a solution to the opening up of the interior.
Everything was done by hand, and they'd have a box there to help the big boxes up onto the side of the camels, and I think their life was a pretty strenuous one, and I don't think any other whites would have wanted to do it.
Camel strings was the worst job, as every morning the camels were loaded and in the evening, sometimes midnight, offloaded. No sooner were we in bed, we would rise, and after the camels, we would go.
Most Cameleers eventually returned to their tribal homelands. A minority stayed and sought wives in Australia. But it wasn't easy.
For a white woman to marry an Afghan, they actually went into their homes and lived the life of what would have been a Muslim woman's life without wearing the veil, you might say. They stayed indoors. They could only go outdoors if they were chaperoned. All the children were brought up learning the Quran, the girls as well.
It probably was hard because they didn't mix in with the Anglo people, like the white communities, and they had to try and mix in with the Aboriginal community. So it would have been hard because they were a different race of people.
The Cameleers travelled up and down the camel pads, delivering goods to remote outback towns. One Cameleer met a young Aboriginal girl named Lallie. They fell in love and were determined to wed.
Jack Akbar came from Karachi, India, at the age of 14 and arrived in Australia with his father in 1893 during the gold rush in Western Australia.
They called him Jack Akbar, yeah. Very gentle person, very strict in his way, in his religion, hard-working, honest.
Jack worked as a cameleer until the advent of motorised transport replaced the camel-carrying industry and he turned to hawking. In his adulthood, it appears he was somewhat of a loner and did not live in the Ghan towns like other Afghans and Indians.
He came here with his father, and from what we gather, he came with his father, who had already come out here to work with on the goldfields with camels. He brought his son with him, and then his father died, so Jack had to make a living, and he multiplied his jobs. He took the government mail. He did do some carting and hawking, and then he worked with other camel men.
In the 1910s, he made several trips to Lyndon near Mount Morgans. It's here that he met his future wife, Lallie, an Aboriginal woman who grew up with her tribe near Laverton.
I fell in love with Jack. He was good and kind and he wanted to marry me. We went to the police for permission to wed, but they didn't give it.
Lallie Akbar.
I guess he was seeking to settle in Australia and have a family, and he wanted Lallie to be his wife.
I think my mum and dad were both very strong-willed, and Daddy was highly principled, and he believed that what he was doing, when he believed that what he was doing was the right thing to do, there was no way you could stop him. He would fight tooth and nail, as they say, to get justice.
In the meantime, Jack Akbar was determined to marry his young sweetheart Lallie, but external forces were keeping them apart. The West Australian government's policy under the supervision of Chief Protector of Aborigines Orba Octavius Neville was quite extraordinary. The policy was to Europeanise and Christianise mixed-blood Aborigines, taking them away from their parents and raising them in missions or orphanages, while full-bloods, he believed, would eventually die out. Neville wrote extensively about his theories on Aborigines.
Central Australia's half-caste problem must be tackled boldly and immediately. The greatest danger, experts agree, is that three races will develop in Australia: white, black, and the pathetic, sinister third race, which is neither.
Orba Octavius Neville.
My mother was Aboriginal, yes, and my father had a couple of shops over there. My father wanted to marry my mother, which was not allowed because he was Asiatic, and they could not marry, Aboriginal people could not marry another coloured race of person.
In Western Australia in the 1920s, the Aboriginal people were under the control of a Chief Protector of Aborigines. And most colonies at time or states had a Chief Protector. But I guess in Western Australia, Chief Protector Neville was notorious for having absolute control of Aboriginal people because his job was to control them.
The native must be helped in spite of himself. Even if a measure of discipline is necessary, it must be applied, but it can be applied in such a way as to appear to be gentle persuasion. The end in view will justify the means employed.
Orba Octavius Neville. On May 23, 1928, Jack and Lallie fled Western Australia. He drove his truck along the railway line to avoid detection and dressed Lallie as a boy.
When I ran away from the Moore River settlement, I went on foot for hundreds of miles searching for Jack. When we arrived in Adelaide, we were married at the registry office. We got together a little home and we were so happy until the police arrested us and took us back to West Australia.
Lallie Akbar.
After all the years of trouble, they finally eloped in today's language and were married in Adelaide. But then the police came over and found where they were and took them back to WA. And there were a few years of court cases, and he won all the cases in the end. And whoever the people were, the top law people, said they exiled them out of Western Australia. Don't ever come back.
Jack and Lallie moved to South Australia, where they lived a quiet life, bringing up their 4 children. For the next generation of Afghans and Indians, holding on to their Islamic faith would be very difficult.
Pretty amazing story. They were ambitious, brave, and maybe a little bit crazy.
Just so I didn't ask them about their heritage and that, you know, what they'd done and where they worked, and it must have been hard.
When I even think about my grandfather and my father, as I said, I'm only a short person, but I stand 10 feet tall because I have that pride. I'm a Mohammed and I'm proud of it. And I don't care who knows it. I've been born with something that's special. And that's where it is with the other Afghan descendants. We're special. We've got something that nobody else can lay claim to.